Greetings and good Monday morning, the 23rd of May, 2022, third decade of the 21st century. If you're new to my channel, I always say that because I think it's a nice juxtaposition over where people thought we would be and what we're talking about. I'm also fascinated by how time flies. I don't know what happened, but sometime in my 30s, all of a sudden, days, weeks, and years just began to fly by in the blink of an eye. And here we are, almost June, meaning that we're almost halfway done with 2022, and I feel like this year just began. But I digress. I was rather busy last week where I had to spend quite a bit of time at the office versus working from home, so I was only able to do a couple of videos. I did get some responses, so as always, I like to read the responses and react. Once again, one of my favorite contributors, Stace Catalin, provided me with some comments to the video. So once again, Stace, thank you so much for not just watching or not just listening, but providing feedback so that we have some sort of a conversation. And without further ado, responding to my first video where I talk about getting in your own way or getting out of your own way and a lot of other things I talked about, Stace responded with, glad to hear that you're getting out there, voting locally. Primaries are good, but I always try to emphasize the importance of local over state and nation because it affects you most closely. Yeah, Stace, there may be issues you and I agree on. There may be issues you and I disagree on. There may be content that you and I agree or disagree on. But you're absolutely right. I think where the rubber meets the road, you have the greatest potential at the local level, and then beyond that at the state level. And I've heard it before, but it really didn't resonate until I heard Dan Crenshaw talk about it. Call it confirmation bias, call it what you will, but being a former combat arms military person, it's hard not to want to listen to Dan Crenshaw. Doesn't mean I agree with him on everything. Plus, he represents the Houston district. So, but yeah, I started to pay more attention to local for two reasons in particular. I was very concerned with the school board, making sure that we don't allow certain socio-political agendas to permeate public education. It's just certain things need to stay what they are. Math is math. Math is not racist. It's not gender biased. Math is math. All right, 1 + 1 = 2. We can see things differently, but from my perspective, my kids don't need to be taught that they need to feel guilty about solving for X because somehow math is economically biased or racially biased or I don't know, sexual persuasion biased or whatever the agenda is that somebody's trying to push. The only one area that I will concede that it can be murky is history. Because yes, history can often be manipulated by the winner, or history can often be manipulated as a matter of perspective. I will concede I will concede some leeway there that, history could and should be objective, but it's not always objective. Science, for that matter, I don't believe science and various other topics. Just in the public sphere, and I've talked about it in previous videos, things need to be as neutral as humanly possible. If you have special interests, if you want those special interests addressed, then perhaps that's where private schools should be entertained. Because I know at least in the realm of religion, or there's a couple other schools that are private, but it's because the best way I know how to say it is they're more advanced, that they're at a more advanced curriculum. But otherwise, a lot of your private schools tend to come from either, yes, more discipline, more academic discipline, more academically challenging, or religion-based. In which case, to put it bluntly, if there's things that parents would like their children to pursue that are not being met in the public sphere, because the public school sphere needs to be in the middle. If you want more left-leaning content, then there should, form your own private school to where your kids can go and not only learn math and science and all that, but they can get a more left-leaning perspective. And then vice versa, if you're more right-leaning and the public school system isn't right enough, then form your own private school for a more right-leaning agenda. And that's kind of how I feel on that. I'm not trying to skew it in any way, shape, or form towards any one political party, because I think there are people that are too far on the right, and I think there are people that are too far on the left. In which case, if that's where you want to exist, and that's the agendas you want to teach your children, then you should have your own place to do so. I don't think it's a form of segregation. I think it's self-induced segregation. Religious people and people who can afford it, they segregate on their own. So I digress. Before that gets taken out of context, which it more than likely will, I'm just going to leave it at that. So yeah, I was very interested in the school board, and then beyond that, I was interested in other positions as far as how they may affect the city and the council at large. And believe it or not, this is my 4th attempt at making this video. I was previously interrupted by my cats, and also I started to bumble and stammer, and I was very incoherent. In the town that I live in, we don't have industry. We have a tremendous amount of low-wage paying jobs due to the abundance of retail and food. And even then, we don't have like a White Castle or a Jack in the Box or a Del Taco or whatever the case may be. Because as I've traveled the States a little bit, there are certain things that are geographic that you just don't see unless you're in a particular area of the States. But I digress. So as far as anybody looking to stay here, we have construction, and basically for several years, people on the city council, people in the county domain have supported all kinds of projects because they're in the construction business. So they support all these projects that support their bottom line, and we've got like an overabundance of these little like 5 or 6 stall strip malls. Which, how many more Domino's delivery places do we need? How many more boutiques do we need? How many more of the, And don't get me wrong, for the people that open these up, I'm sure it means a hell of a lot to them. But it doesn't do a whole lot for the community when 90% of the jobs are low-wage paying jobs, especially if you're trying to grow exponentially and compete with New Bern or Wilmington. So yeah, you're right. Getting involved in the local elections meant a lot. And then, of course, talking with other people and getting involved, you learn some of the importance of other positions like the sheriff, how important that can be, the district attorney and how important that can be, county commissioners and what they can control. So yeah, appreciate you hitting on that. Although, Stace, I'd be curious to know, aside from talking about the whole voting aspect, if there was anything else in that video that may have resonated or may have provided you with something to comment on, other than the fact that it was an hour long, which I get. Moving on. You would like to hear my thoughts on Fred Savage's current behavior and scandal. Well, so the first time I had heard of it was every morning I take my son to the bus stop and we'll sit there for 10, 15, 20 minutes waiting on the bus. We don't really do anything. We just kind of sit there and occasionally talk to each other, but it's just time that we get to spend. And last week, 2 guys named Chris, which is the talk show that's on in the morning, it's supposed to be comedy-based, they were talking about how Fred Savage was fired, and then they were talking about previous accusations and whatnot. I don't know. In truth, I have a lot of different thoughts. My first initial thought is, yes, Fred Savage was Kevin from the Wonder Years, which I grew up on. I think before it ended, I eventually started working in high school, and I was watching a lot less TV because of how much I was working. Beyond that, Fred Savage has tried to, make a bit of a comeback, so to speak, with various other shows. You'd also hinted on it before with Allison Mack, the product of being a child star. Yeah, Fred Savage was a child star. He did a lot of movies, and then he did the Wonder Years. So I don't know if there was a certain amount of ego built up with inside of him. Not saying it justifies his behavior, but oftentimes it's quite fascinating what people can justify in their own minds. When it comes to the accusations, I find myself a bit hypersensitive, and I find myself a bit overwhelmed with confirmation bias based on my own experiences. In which case, I find that I'm leaning heavily towards, oh, is this real? Is he really a douchebag? Is he really guilty? Or is it being blown out of proportion because somebody's trying to capitalize on existing trends and are trying to cash in on some potential social currency in their favor to slander Fred Savage? Or is he really a douchebag? And that was kind of what I was trying to get at with the whole Joss Whedon thing was, is it really this or is it possibly that? And at the end of the day, what is it really? That's kind of where I'm at with Fred Savage. I was reading through an article, and there were previous allegations of poor conduct. I guess at the risk of sounding rude, condescending, or at the risk of sounding in any way, shape, or form negative, or I don't know, whatever the emotion could be, I don't know that I care. I don't know that I care enough about Fred Savage. I don't know that, yeah, he was Kevin from the Wonder Years, but I just don't know that I have enough emotional investment to really care. Oh, Fred Savage was fired from the new version of the Wonder Years, which is trying to capitalize on existing social trends by telling it a different way. I don't know that I care. And I don't mean that to be harsh. I just, part of my channel is just me being honest. And I just don't know that I care. Whether he was an ass or not, I think at some point you have to accept a certain amount of responsibility. If let's just say hypothetically, let's just create a scenario. If you're someone like Fred Savage, heterosexual Caucasian male, you don't have a lot of social currency. And with recent events like Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, Joss Whedon, and perhaps others, that you need to tread lightly. That right now, if you want to remain relevant and or if you want to keep your job or whatever the case may be, then for the time being, until these things run their course, you need to basically follow the social rules. You need to, abide by the social trends, the whatever's going on in that particular time. And right now, if you cannot conform to what is popular in society right now, which will allow you to keep your job, then that's your fault. I mean, he should know how terribly sensitive Hollywood is right now, and how extremely left-leaning Hollywood is, and how quick they are to, execute. No trial, no nothing, just boom. As soon as there's an allegation, you're guilty. And your guilt is also determined based on your social currency, of which Fred Savage probably has a limited amount of. So I think at that point, there could be a little bit of embellishment on the accusations. However, whether there's embellishment or not, he should know what the approved standards of conduct are for 2022. And it should be incumbent upon him to try to conform, because unfortunately in this modern day and age, it's not about them conforming to him, it's about him conforming to them. And I'm going to put the responsibility on him that he probably could have done a much better job, because this isn't the 80s. This isn't the 90s. The things that may have been allowed back then are not allowed right now. So, yeah, I'd have to say that I've got a bit of a lack of sympathy. I think I'm not saying he's wrongfully accused, but I'm thinking that in today's day and era, especially if you strike first, if you make the accusations first, you're the one to you're able to establish it as truth first. It doesn't have to be truth, but if you're the first one to level an allegation, then you're the first one to establish it as truth in the court of public opinion. And I think in that sphere, in the Hollywood sphere, Fred Savage should have been more sensitive to that and should have been more mindful of it. And who knows, maybe he was. Maybe he was being very mindful, and maybe, most rational people could have potentially agreed with his outburst based on based on the situation. His conduct may have been utterly justified based on what was happening, but because he was like, look, I need to correct the problem, I corrected it, I'm moving on, let's be productive, but instead somebody got butthurt. So you can see where this can become very complex, but I thank you so much for bringing it up, because it gives us something to talk about. But yeah, I think there could be so much more to it. I just don't know how much I want to invest. But you tell me. If you want to keep talking about it, we can absolutely talk about it. I got no problem talking about it. But we have more. So you continue on with The Mandalorian. I disagree with Gina Carano, but I also do not believe she should have been fired for freedom of speech. So Stace, on that particular note, I looked up her tweets. Hang on a second. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to press pause for one moment, because there was a lot of outrage over her tweet, which on the surface is fine, but I'm curious if she was saying it in response to something. So give me a minute. I'm going to go ahead and research that. Okay, so as I was saying, this is the 4th time I've attempted to make this video. Short version is there were some distractions, and I started to get distracted, and then I started to stutter, stammer, and spiral. So getting back to the whole Gina Carano thing, Stace, I looked. So unlike you, I don't disagree with what she said, but you and I may also be on two different sides of the coin here. So let me just go ahead and get to this. According to the New York Post, which I don't entirely agree with or enjoy, the Star Wars giant made no secret of why she was canceled, ripping her social media posts, denigrating people based on their cultural and religious identities, which it called abhorrent and unacceptable. In which case, Carano's most controversial message, and the one that appears to have been the final straw, came when she shared an image of Nazi Germany and compared it to today's overheated political climate. So, in that context, I agree. The political climate is extremely heated. If you were doing a point scale, I would have to say that the left is currently in the lead as far as cancel culture, suppressing people, canceling people. We don't have to agree on that, but in my perspective, the people on the left are stifling and shutting down. And I mean, look at the reaction over Elon Musk. Who'd have thought he'd have been the biggest proponent of free speech when free speech used to be a liberal concept? But I digress. This was her tweet. Jews were beaten in the streets, not by Nazi soldiers, but by their neighbors, even by children. Because history is edited, most people today don't realize that to get to the point where Nazi soldiers could easily round up thousands of Jews, the government first made their own neighbors hate them simply for being Jews. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And I think what she was alluding to, which the New York Post doesn't talk about, like what she was directly responding to, is what Nazi Germany did was it fired up its own people. It got its own people motivated in the Nazi ideology. All right, the nationalism, the socialism, so on and so forth, and it convinced the Nazi Germans that there were people that were directly responsible for everything that they were suffering from. Now you have to keep in mind, the Germany was on the losing side of World War I, and there was a steep price to pay, and Germany was basically not in a good position. Germany was kind of like going through its own form of depression and recession as a result of, I guess, what you would call the price that they had to pay, their reparations for their part in World War I. That being said, Adolf Hitler and all of his compatriots rallied the German people, gave them confidence, motivated them, let them know that they were not bad, that they were not evil, that other people were responsible for all of their problems. Not unlike things that are currently happening in this country, where we have a blame game, and this is just my perspective, nobody has to agree, but the left and or the Democrats love to celebrate the victim. They love to tell everybody why they're a victim, and they love to tell them exactly who's responsible for their victim status so that they have someone to blame, and why you should vote for the Democrats because you're a victim of this group of people. And as a result, you have BLM and Antifa, who are like a militant wing of the Democratic Party, not unlike the KKK was at the fall of the Confederacy and on the outset of the Civil War. So what happened was, because the Nazi Party gave the average everyday German somebody to blame for their woes. You're a victim because of this. It's not your fault. These are the people to blame. That they basically encourage the concept and behavior of singling out your neighbors. All right? If they're not with the Nazi Party, then they're against the Nazi Party. And if they fall into this category, if they're Jewish, if they're gay, if they have a mental handicap of any kind, if they have a physical handicap of any kind, if they're a gypsy, if there was any reason why they could be seen as opposition to the Nazi Party, they must be sought out and they must be dealt with harshly, up to and include eradication. All right, the Jews weren't the only ones eradicated in concentration camps, but statistically, by and large, they were the heaviest hit population of people, which is not entirely a culture, it's a faith, but I digress. That's an entirely different conversation. So it's a bit of a long walk for a short drink of water to say, I agree with what she's saying. Because in today's day and era, in our country, what she may have been responding to is, you have a political faction, all right? Whether it's a part of the Democratic Party, a wing of the Democratic Party, whatever the case may be, an extreme faction of the Democratic Party, you whether it's cancel culture, whether it's doxing, whatever the case may be, I think she was making a direct reference to that. And if that was the context, I understand if maybe you don't agree with the context, but historically, her example was accurate. And I think maybe it was taken out of context. I think the cancel culture mob got a hold of it, blew it out of context, and directly influenced Disney to make a snap judgment. And the proof is in the pudding. And I don't know if they did this on purpose. I don't know who gets the profits, but if you go online and search for Cara Dune figurines or anything to do with Cara Dune, it is belligerently expensive. So if Gina Carano gets a cut of that because it's her image, cool. If George Lucas gets a cut of that, whatever. But somebody's profiting off of her being canceled. Secondly, I will admit in full complete honesty, I'm a fan of Gina Carano. So potentially I have some confirmation bias there. Um, so hopefully I'm not overwhelmed by my confirmation bias. But having said all that, I was not torn up with what she said because in my opinion, she was making the direct correlation that just like Nazi Germany, in our own country, we have the cancel culture mob, going after people and then watching how businesses, how government is reacting to the mob. So, I feel like I've probably talked about that at length already. So, uh, by all means, Stace, I'd love to get your feedback for no other purpose than creating this conversation, because I think what you and I are demonstrating is, whether we agree or disagree on a topic, maintaining a level of civility, maintaining a sense of decorum, and like, oh, okay, well, I see it differently, but I recognize you as a human being. I recognize you as an American citizen. I recognize you as a good person. We just disagree. We don't have to go to war over it. But there's more. The WBCW was good about casting like Annette, with Supergirl Helen Slater, who played Supergirl in the movie, and Dean Cain, who played Kara's adoptive parents. In that reference, yeah, I think you're commenting on the fact that with Smallville, Smallville was really good at making an effort to acknowledge people who had been involved in the Superman legacy. Dean Cain, who played Clark Kent, Superman on Lois and Clark, Terry Hatcher, they both made appearances in Smallville. Christopher Reeve, who played Superman in the Richard Donner films, he made an appearance in Smallville. Margot Kidder, who played the original Lois Lane in the Richard Donner films, she made an appearance. Helen Slater made an appearance. You're absolutely right. And not only that, but the CW has been really good at recycling its talent. And I personally first noticed it, at least with some degree of like oh my god, where first it was Jensen Ackles being recycled as Dean Winchester, Jared Padalecki being recycled as Sam Winchester, James Marsters being recycled as Brainiac. I was fascinated how, and I don't know if that was a retainment contract thing. I don't know. Erica Durrance talks about it on the podcast with Michael Rosenbaum, where I think she signed like a contract with the WB or something like that. So I don't know if that's got anything to do with contracting. But yeah, the WB/CW has been really good at like recycling people, and the list goes on and on. So I don't need to spend time going over the laundry list of people, but I loved the throwbacks. Now, to be fair, I've not watched Supergirl. I know it's ended, but I have not watched it. On that note, Stace, I'm going to take a different direction here and try to stimulate some conversation. Hopefully, stimulate your ability to respond. The CW seems to be cleaning house lately, and I feel like the Berlanti DC universe is taking a major hit. Legends of Tomorrow is not being renewed, so it's done. So basically, we've gotten the series finale, which I don't think was a good series finale, and as far as I know, it's not being brought back. Batwoman is being canceled. Give me 1 second. Let me do some research. Okay, I'm back. So, Stace, I compiled a list, and for anybody else who stumbles upon this, so according to CBR.com, the CW canceled Legends of Tomorrow. So basically, its season finale is now the series finale. Batwoman is being canceled. Legacies is being canceled. Riverdale will be canceled, but being allowed to do a series finale. Naomi's been canceled. The 4400's been canceled. Roswell's been canceled. In the Dark has been canceled. Charmed has been canceled. And Dynasty has been canceled. Dynasty and Charmed are reboots from an original story. Roswell's a reboot. Somebody said 4400 was a reboot. Naomi, I don't know. Riverdale was an original based on the Archie comics. Legacies was a spin-off from the Vampire Diaries. And then, of course, Batwoman and Legends of Tomorrow were part of the DC universe, which tells me that The Flash, Black Lightning, and Stargirl, I think, are being allowed to exist. Arrow ran its course. Supergirl ran its course, although I never watched Supergirl, so I don't know if it ran its course, if it had a good start and finish, or if it seems like it ended abruptly. I've heard a lot of different stuff from different sources here and there that within the Berlanti verse, whether or not Berlanti and his team had anything to do with this, or if the CW injected itself. The CW, I think, has been known for attempting to reach a younger audience, but more importantly, by reaching a younger audience, trying to address modern day social, to include socio-political issues. I know from the onset, within the first 2 episodes of Roswell, I mean, it felt like a socio-political agenda just being shoved down your throat by a fist. Like, oh. And I was like, well, I'm done. I don't know if that was the case with other shows, and if the whole mantra of go woke, go broke has anything to do with anything. I really don't know, because with the exception of Legends of Tomorrow, I didn't really watch anything else. I know from my understanding within that whole DC universe, Stephen Amell called it the Berlanti-verse, or some people call it the Arrowverse, because it started with Arrow, then came the Flash, and then Legends of Tomorrow, and then everything else. But Stephen Amell called it the Berlanti-verse because it really came from the mind of Greg Berlanti. I don't know what the reasonings are, but I will have a link in the description that you can go to. I know a lot of it has to do with ratings. So if the ratings aren't there, then it's very difficult to justify keeping something on, in spite of the fact that within the people who do watch it, it's very near and dear to their heart. It's what they really tune in for, but they're just not a big enough audience to keep it. I understand. I'm not saying I agree necessarily, because look what happened to Firefly. I don't know why, if any, that these shows didn't get as much popularity. I don't know if it was their time slot. I don't know if it was their storytelling. I know, talking to my wife and my daughter, when Luke Perry died unexpectedly, I don't know if the showrunners knew how to deal with it on Riverdale, because Luke Perry played Archie's dad. But apparently Riverdale, like One Tree Hill, for those that are familiar with One Tree Hill, Riverdale took a violent turn. I don't mean like in the form of violence. I mean like it was like doing a U-turn. It just went in a completely different direction, and my wife and daughter, I think, stopped somewhere around season 4, where they were like, what? So I don't know if these other shows were like that, but I'll be curious. Like, they're even doing a spin-off on Walker. And Stace, as far as I know, you and I are both Supernatural fans. I'm curious to know what your take on Walker is, because I'll give you my 2 cents, which I've given before. To use the name Walker in the same context of Walker Texas Ranger Chuck Norris, I think there's a certain legacy you have to acknowledge. The Chuck Norris Walker Texas Ranger had a lot to do with, hi-ya, hand-to-hand combatives. He was just a hand-to-hand combatives badass. Now, Jared doesn't necessarily need to be a karate expert, but I was anticipating a little bit more of less gun, more hua, and I was not anticipating him being portrayed as being so emotionally damaged. Not having watched the Chuck Norris Walker Texas Ranger, I don't know. I know they're trying to go in a different direction, and I apologize if I come across as stammering or just all over the place, but whether or not I'm just too, what's the word I'm looking for? Jared spent 15 years as Sam, all right? I will always see him as Sam, and I'm more than willing to allow him to branch out and try other characters. I just don't know if trying to capitalize on the franchise that was Walker Texas Ranger based on the story they're trying to tell, if that was a good idea. I think maybe I think they were trying to capitalize on the legacy of Walker Texas Ranger, but to tell their own story in their own version, which conflicts with the original Walker. And it's just my opinion on the subject. And for me, what it did is I'm like, oh, okay, this is your version of Walker Texas Ranger, but you're gonna hold true to some of the original version, right? Like the comics, they can retell the same story just in a different light. So what's your light gonna be? But instead, it's like, oh no, 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 this is like completely different. Well, then you should change the name. You shouldn't try to capitalize on the name. But that's just my thoughts. It's not a horrible show, but I don't know, it's some of it in how they're portraying Jared's character as just being like this bumbling, emotionally wrecked guy. I don't know. We'll see. But Stace, I'm curious to get your input as far as like, what are your thoughts and opinions as far as, did they try to push too hard with expanding the Arrow Berlanti verse? Did they try to push certain things too hard that didn't resonate with fans? I don't know. I'm curious. Dynasty was from my childhood. My mom and my grandmother loved Dynasty. I couldn't stand it, so never watched it. And as far as any of these other shows, I don't know if you got into them as well, but based on how many shows are being canceled, I can see where it could be an opportunity to stimulate some conversation. But as it is, I've been going for 37 minutes. I think it's time for me to shut up. If you're new to my channel, I don't normally try to make videos this long, so that was my New Year's resolution. I apologize for going this long. But ultimately, I don't care if you like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. All I'm trying to do is stimulate conversation, and in a manner of which that we maintain a certain level of decorum, civility, and decency, and just recognize each other as people who can see things differently. But as part of my New Year's resolution, I'm terribly glad Stace is getting involved. I really wanted to nerd out and get meta over some of the stuff that I'm interested in, that others may be interested in too. With that in mind, I'm going to continue to work on producing kind of like a commentary on each episode via season of Smallville. So like there'll be a compilation of season 1, a compilation of season 2, but more importantly, show little video clips of each season, do like a 3 to 5 minute commentary, move through the entire season. That's my ultimate plan. We'll see if it pans out to fruition. Other than that, please leave a comment, get involved in the conversation. Let's nerd out together over some of this content and just have our own little community, enjoying getting meta and dorky. You're awesome.